Federico. We are back with another episode of App Stories, this time brought to you by Pingdom, Backblaze, and Linode. I'm John Voorhees, and of course, Federico Viticci is with me because he's been around now for, I can't get rid of him. He's been around for 215 episodes, and now we're on number 216. How about that?
Well, sure. Hi. I've always been around. I've always been here.
I know. Did you think I was trying to get rid of you? I try not to let it show that much that I've been trying to sub you out at some point. But
you can try. If you want, I can leave for a few episodes, and you can do the show as a monologue.
Be careful what you wish for. Is that what you're telling me?
No. I'm just saying, maybe if you want me gone, then I'll be gone for a few episodes, and then if you'll miss me, I'll come back.
No, I want you to stay. I want you to stay. I already miss you just thinking about it, Federico.
All right, that's good.
All right.
That's a good sign.
It is a good
that's
sign.
That's a healthy thing for a podcast where two people have to talk to each other. That's a good thing.
It's true. We shouldn't have. We never really want a website out there that is like our Federico and John fighting.com. You don't want to see that ever. But all right, Federico, I want to talk to you today. I want to kick it off and talk to you a little bit about Substack.
Okay. What's you should explain first what Substack is. I think it's very popular in the tech community, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily mainstream yet.
No, it's not. I think it's still relatively small, but it is it's a platform for email newsletters, and writers have been using it. And I think why it's gotten a lot of traction in the tech community recently is that a lot of high-profile tech writers at places like The Verge and the New York Times have left their big media jobs to strike out on Substack. And what Substack allows them to do is to offer free and paid subscriptions for their newsletters. So a really good example, there are a lot of good examples, I guess, but a couple of that I've been keeping an eye on lately is Charlie Warzel just left the New York Times, and he's got a newsletter called Galaxy Brain, and he's doing that.
Name.
It is a really good name. There's all of a sudden though, I'm seeing Galaxy Brain used all over the place.
Yes,
there's there's a podcast called that too.
Yeah, on Polygon, I believe, right?
Yeah, I think so, right.
Yes.
So there are a bunch of things called that. But that's Charlie Warzel's newsletter. And then Casey Newton did this too, and he started one called The Platform. Now, he had that newsletter while he was still at The Verge for a while, and then he struck out on his own entirely. And so, he publishes, I think, one free newsletter a week, but then if you're a subscriber, you get it at least a couple more times a week. And one of the reasons that I've been keeping an eye on this recently is that something really interesting happened. Email newsletters aren't anything new. I mean, obviously, we've been doing one since 2015, but what Substack offers to writers is kind of a turnkey solution that makes it super easy and convenient to get started. Because, if you're a writer, even if you're a tech writer, you're not necessarily someone who's familiar with setting up a payment processing service like Stripe or MailChimp or all those kind of things. And a lot of these reporters at these big publications have fairly significant followings online, whether it's on Twitter or some other platform. And as a result, they're able to, to spin up a Substack instance, so to speak, and start bringing in subscribers, making it a lot easier for them to go out and strike out on their own and become indie writers. Now, one reason I've been thinking about a lot lately is that Casey Newton has done something very interesting. I think he was the one spearheading this to a large degree, is that seven different indie writers have gotten together as kind of a collective and started a Discord. And the way this works is, I believe not every single one of them is on Substack, but most of them are. And each of them has a group inside Discord with some public channels as well as some private channels. And if you're a subscriber to Substack, you get in the private channels. And if you're not, you don't. And I subscribe to The Platform, Casey Newton's newsletter. And so in that group of channels,
Platformer, I think it's
the Platformer. I'm sorry. Yes, the Platformer. Yeah. Casey has 4 or 5 different channels, and one of them is a members only channel. And so I can get into that one, but I can't get into the other 6 writers because I don't subscribe to any of theirs at the moment. Charlie Warzel is in there too, and a bunch of other people. And it's really interesting because it does something that I think Substack really doesn't do very well, which is creating a community around these writers. And it also leverages the fact that, Casey Newton could have created his own Discord just by himself, but
Right.
by bringing in these other writers who covered similar but different beats, there's like internet culture and cybersecurity and other topics covered, it rounds it out a lot better. And it's a very interesting approach to, I guess, modern tech writing.
Yeah, it sort of creates that halo effect, but for writers, right? You're bringing together a bunch of writers and create a community around them, and then because there's also like different community events happening, I think it's very clever because you're more inclined to start with one writer and then maybe discover the work of somebody else, and so you also become a subscriber of that person. I think it's a really clever approach. And I'm also a member. I'm also a subscriber to the Platformer myself. I haven't checked out the Discord yet, but what I will say about Substack is that it does a really good job at simplifying a lot of interactions that tend to be a little more convoluted with traditional newsletters like MailChimp, for example. Things like updating your email address or upgrading from one plan to another, logging in from Safari and so on. It's not just an email newsletter, but it's also a web platform of sorts, because you can choose to have the email delivered to your address so it lands in your inbox, but you can also log in with your account on the web. So I think they're doing a lot of really interesting things to remove as much friction as possible. And that also includes the Substack Reader, which I believe it is in beta at this point. It's basically Substack building their own reader for newsletters. However, it also comes with support for RSS feeds. So you can combine newsletters and traditional blogs within the same reader. That right now, this Substack Reader, it's only on the web. I think they're working on native apps for phones and tablets, where I think it's, especially on an iPad, I think it's where it makes the most sense. It's a really fascinating approach. It's not something that I would consider for myself because, App Stories readers, they know me. They know that I like to control the technologies that I use as much as possible. But I can appreciate something like Substack to remove friction from the experience of reading newsletters and subscribing to newsletters. But I also applaud something like what Casey Newton and others are doing in sort of forming a community around their work, which, especially right now with the pandemic still going on, folks have a lot of time to chat and hang on the internet because they haven't been able to meet their friends and talk to their friends in real life for a long time. And so it makes a lot of sense as an approach.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see what efforts like this side channel Discord has on Substack, because I think one thing that Substack doesn't do very well is do anything but newsletters, and the newsletters all have a bit of a samey feel to them, which makes it difficult for these writers to kind of build their own brand and identity online. And I do feel like some writers who are particularly successful on Substack may, once they have got a big enough subscriber base and made enough money to kind of reinvest that into their their indie experience, that they'll be able to spin something off on their own and create a website and other things. I mean, I think this is a great way to get started without having to put a lot of money into it, but you are giving a cut to Substack and they are in control of kind of the look and feel of the experience online. Whereas, that's kind of the benefit we have with Mac Stories, is that Mac Stories is exactly the way we want it to be, and no one else is dictating that, and no one's taking a cut. Now, there's a lot more work that goes into doing that. There's a lot of development work and other pieces to the puzzle, but I do feel like writers might start going that direction at some point, depending on how successful they are.
Right.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Pingdom from SolarWinds. If you have a website, what purpose does it serve? Whether you're driving people to your products, collecting sales leads for your company, or providing customer service with a contact form, When these things fail, you lose business. Not to mention your users have a bad experience. But there's a solution. Transaction monitoring from Pingdom. Starting at just $10 a month, transaction monitoring runs checks 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and will alert you when your cart checkout or login pages fail. Before they affect your customers and your business, Pingdom will notify you over SMS, email, or via your favorite app like Slack, OpsGenie, and PagerDuty. Depending on what's being monitored or the sensitivity of the outage, you can customize who's alerted and how they get the notification. Don't let your users discover the problem for you with your website. You should be the first to know, and it's super easy to get started. Just go to pingdom.com/signup right now for a 30-day free trial with no credit card required. Then, when you're ready to buy, use the code AppStories at checkout to get a huge 30% off your first invoice. Again, that URL is pingdom.com/signup. And when you're ready to buy, the code AppStories to get 30% off that first invoice. Our thanks to Pingdom from SolarWinds for their support of App Stories. I guess we've got email on the brain, Federico, don't we?
Yes. There's a lot of things happening around email, which sort of to an extent kind of derailed my week because it's something that I needed to take care of, but also it's sort of turned into a topic for the show as well as what I wrote in Mac Stories Weekly last Friday. So I guess it all worked out. Everything is research, as we said previously here on the show and other places. I talked about this for almost 40 minutes on Connected last Wednesday. As you may have heard, I personally decided, and we decided as a company with Mac Stories, to stop using Hey, the email service by Basecamp, following the announcement of some policy changes internally at Basecamp regarding the silencing of political and societal discussions and the shutting down of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusivity Committee at Basecamp, and a bunch of other policy decisions that I personally cannot fathom to understand. Like, I cannot even begin to understand what the angle is there. I think Basecamp is making a terrible mistake with these policy decisions, and I highly recommend listening to that segment of Connected from last week, as well as reading Casey Newton writing on these Basecamp issues on the Platformer newsletters, as well as his first story. Casey's first story is on The Verge, so you can check it out on The Verge as well to get an idea of what happened exactly at Basecamp. But basically, long story short, we needed to move from Hey, and we John and I, thankfully, Mac Stories is a small operation. John, you tweeted about this, and we were able to move quickly, right?
That's exactly right. And, I don't want to rehash everything that you guys discussed on Connected because I think we have a lot of listeners who probably have already heard that. But I agree wholeheartedly with the position that you took there, as well as Mike and Steven. And, you and I had conversations about this over iMessage immediately once the story broke. And it became clear instantaneously to us that it was time to move. There are a lot of times when you see something happening at a business that you don't like, and sometimes it's a hard call because maybe it's a very critical piece of your infrastructure, or maybe what's going on is going on with a particular employee, but not the CEO or the founders. And it can be a hard balancing act, but this was nowhere near that sort of hard call gray area. This was so far over the line that it was, I think, to both of us, very clear instantly that we had to move. And part of that, honestly, is that we have been talking about Hey a fair amount on this show and elsewhere because we really like the service, and and we still do, frankly. But the thing is that these policies are so egregious and so awful that we felt that there's no way we could align Mac Stories with that any longer and had to get away. And so what we, as I tweeted, it's fairly easy for us to do. I mean, it's easy to make the change. It's harder to adapt to the change, which is what Federico alluded to earlier in the show, which is both of us, I think, have spent more time than we would have liked during a busy week setting up new email apps and making sure that we're not missing messages from people, because I started getting quite stressed by the middle of the week because I felt like I had zero handle on my email as of about Wednesday. But this morning, as I record this, I feel like I've got control of it again. But it's not quite as good as it was, I don't think. I actually really appreciated the workflow associated with Hey, but there are ways to kind of approximate a lot of what it was doing, and there's a lot of choice. So it was really a non-decision in a lot of ways. Federico and I, it wasn't like we debated this. We both were like, yeah, we got to move this as soon as we possibly can, and we did.
Yeah, some things, as the saying goes, you'll know it when you see it, and that's the kind of thing where it's immediately apparent that it's beyond wrong. It's just unacceptable, and there's a lot of things to get upset about in the world, and especially in the tech scene. And this is one of them that is so beyond what I accept as a business owner, as the kind of services that we use, the kind of vendors that we use, that it was just immediately clear. Like John and I, we just needed like a single text message, like we got to move, right? And like we reached the decision in like 30 seconds, I believe. So
right.
But yes, we've been dealing with the aftermath of that. So I will say from a practical standpoint, like if you're interested in knowing how I actually moved, the DNS records and actually making the transition of 6 months of email in the Hey service back to Gmail, which is what we've gone back for now, because it's what we were using before. We had our old accounts still open and waiting for us. I wrote about this in last week's issue of Mac Stories Weekly, issue 270. What I want to talk about right now, I guess, is how we've been dealing with the consequence of switching again to Gmail, as well as what we're looking for as a team, and sort of why in testing, Apple Mail again, I realized something about data portability that also leads to another topic in this week's episode. So to contextualize everything here, what we really liked about Hey were the team sharing and collaboration features. The fact that you can share a thread with a teammate without having to use the traditional forwarding system. That adds a lot of craft and like syntax to your email. And also when you forward an email to somebody else, it loses the original sender, right? So if I get an email from, Mike Hurley, and I forward that email to John gets an email from me, doesn't get an email from Mike.
Yeah, right.
So that's the issue with regular forwarding. With sharing, which is a bunch of email services these days, they come with sharing features. These are proprietary features, right? They are built on top of email. And Hey has one of those proprietary functionalities that lets you share threads with your team. You can leave comments, you can share, and you can also build collections of email messages. Those were, I would say, the top features that we liked about Hey as a team. For personal usage, what I really loved about Hey, and I think John agrees with me, is all the little touches. Things like the screener, for example, how you could easily screen a contact in or out of your inbox. Or I also liked the separation between the inbox and the paper trail, so that all kinds of regular messages will go in the inbox. Everything else, things like receipts, confirmation emails, like when you sign up for a service and you get a confirmation, all that kind of stuff, it went into the paper trail. And I really like that.
I like too that you could bundle those emails. So, I get several test flight notifications a day, really, and I could bundle those up, and they just end up as a stack inside of my paper trail section of Hey, which was great. The other thing that it's like a real subtle thing, but one thing that I think Hey did particularly well is that when you dealt with something from the inbox, let's say, for instance, Federico, I got an email from you and I let it sit in my inbox for 3 or 4 days before I actually did anything with it. In a regular email program, once I do something with that, once it's marked as read, it just slots in and stays 4 days down in the stack. Whereas in Hey, once it left the inbox, because I dealt with it in some way or another, it would be at the top. And that actually was pretty good because it meant all the things that I'd use. It was more like a recently dealt with email list than it was a chronological list of the emails, the way they came into the system. And I kind of liked that because it meant that I didn't have to kind of search through a long list necessarily to find one that was from 4 days ago, way down the list with, maybe 20 or 30 emails in between. So there are things like that. There was also collections, which, for instance, if we had a project that you and I were working on that we both needed to kind of keep tabs on what was happening, we would put the emails in there. And the thing that was a little different from collections than actually just sharing emails is that they could be emails from multiple different people. So, you and I might be dealing with our taxes, and so we might be dealing with our accountant, we might be dealing with our lawyer, and all those emails we could dump into our collection for 2020 taxes, and they'd all show up there, and you and I could find them again very easily without having to go searching. So a lot of little things like that. I mean, I think that there are ways to replicate that to a degree in other systems. And I also feel like there are some things that were missing from Hey that I had missed while we were using it. Things like the ability to set up detailed rules based on, text and subject lines and things like that, that you couldn't use there, that you can use in some other apps. So yeah, we ought to talk about email a little more, I guess. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Backblaze. Unlimited computer backup for Macs and PCs for just $6 a month. Back up all your stuff: documents, music, photos, videos, drawings, projects, everything. Do you live in the EU? You can even select that your data be stored in the EU region when signing up for a trial. Restore files from anywhere, too. Directly download them from the web or restore via the mail. If you choose Restore by Mail, you purchase a hard drive from Backblaze, who will overnight it to you via FedEx. After you restore, you can return the hard drive to them for a refund. Worried about accidentally deleting files? For just an extra $2 a month, you can increase your retention history by a whole year. Once backed up, all of your data is available wherever you are. Not only is there the web option, but there's also a mobile app. With more than 50 billion files recovered and downloaded, you'll never facepalm about forgetting your presentation at home again. I've been using Backblaze for years, and I even bought subscriptions for 2 of my kids when they went off to college so that their stuff would be protected too. It's a great investment. What's more, we use Backblaze's B2 cloud storage solution at MacStories to store all the images you see on the website. Get a free, fully featured, no credit card required backup trial today at backblaze.com/MacStories. Again, that URL is backblaze.com/MacStories so that they know you came from the show. To get a fully featured 15-day free trial, go to backblaze.com/MacStories. Start protecting yourself from potential bad times today with Backblaze. Our thanks to Backblaze for their support of the show.
In switching back to Gmail, after importing all of our old messages, I guess, what I realized was that we needed, at the very least, some basic implementation of sharing, as well as replicating to an extent, at least, the screener feature of Hey. And so what I did very quickly, I came to the conclusion that we needed to try Spark again. So Spark by Riddle, it's a popular email client that we covered many times on Mac Stories and App Stories before. And one of the later additions to Spark last couple of years ago, I believe, was the team sharing features. So now in Spark, you can share an email with a teammate or with multiple members of your team. You can leave comments on email threads. You can delegate. You can share. There's a bunch of different collaborative email features in Spark. So what I did was I set up Spark with my Google Workspace account, which would be what used to be called G Suite. Now it's called Google Workspace.
I never know where to go, by the way, to find Google. I always look for Google Apps for my domain, which I think ages me because I think that's what it was originally called, right?
It used to be called Google Apps, then it became G Suite, and now it's Google Workspace. Google likes to change their names. So I set up Spark again. been sharing emails with John using Spark, and it's fine. I actually, Spark, I'm a little torn about it because on the one hand, it's got some real nice design touches, like the way that it formats threads and replies, and tries to clean up the email syntax of like indented, quoted replies, that kind of stuff. Spark does a lot of work behind the scenes to clean that up and present it with a custom UI. It's really well done. I love the fact that they're now using native context menus when you long press on a message. It's really nicely done. However, on the other hand, there's like a bunch of things that I don't understand, like why does the app not support a native 3-column layout on iPad? And on iPad, when you want to show the sidebar, it's an overlay that blocks the rest of the UI.
Right. So you can't, for instance, drag an email into another folder. You have to use a move button instead.
You got to use a move button.
Yeah, I ran into that last night.
Yes. And there's a bunch of things like that Spark tries to strike a balance between its own take on certain UI elements and combine those with actual native iOS components.
Right.
And sometimes that mix is a little weird. Like you have custom share sheets and custom pop-up menus, but then if you long press on a message, you have a native context menu.
Right.
And it's a little weird in places.
Yeah, it is, and that I think that's something. Well, when we get to talking about app silos, I think that is a hallmark of some app silos is the use of kind of a custom thing that makes it hard to deal with your content elsewhere. What I will give Spark a lot of credit for, though, is the fact that they have a linking system. And that makes it very easy to copy a link to a message out. Now, you could do that in Hey, but Hey was a web app, and I found it very confusing when I used Hey to understand whether I was copying a link to the email message or a link to something else in the message sometimes, because it was, it was an Electron app and it behaved a little strangely. But with Spark, it's very clear that you're creating a link to the email and you can make it public or private. And I use that a lot because if I send a message to somebody and I want to follow up with them in several days, I will make a task in Good Task. And then in the notes field, I'll drop the Spark email link so I can easily find out whatever the discussion was beforehand before I get back to that person. So that's something I use a lot. And the other thing, Federico, I think that I missed a little bit from Hey that I like about Spark is the ability to send things later. Now, I know I don't think that's something that you use, but because we deal with so many people, especially in Europe, I find that my best writing I do in the mornings. So a lot of times I'll be writing emails to people in what is fairly late in the day for them in Europe. And I don't always I sometimes feel bad that I'm sending someone an email and it's going to show up on their phone or something at 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. or even later. And so I like the ability to say, send this at 4 a.m. my time, so that it's coming mid-morning to them in Germany or wherever they happen to be. Right. And so I do use that, especially when I'm dealing with advertisers and that kind of thing, a fair amount. And I wasn't doing that while we were using Hey, but I think I'm going to start doing that again more often.
And obviously, I also mentioned this on Connected. It's been a sponsor of our shows before, but I'm also personally, I'm a user. I'm a happy user. I'm using SaneBox again to have that separation between important stuff goes in the inbox, everything else goes into Sane Later, and newsletter type stuff goes into Sane News. So it's fine because, again, on the topic of going beyond the silo, SaneBox is a good example of a service that allows you to have cross-platform sort of a open integration with all kinds of email clients because it works with your email account directly. You can integrate SaneBox with your Google account, and so no matter the email client you're using, SaneBox's intelligence is in the cloud, so it follows you around and it doesn't lock you in a specific system. However, so here's what I wanted to mention. In setting all of this up, I had to use Apple Mail because I needed to download my message history from Hey,
Right.
and there was an .mbox file which I needed to use with Apple Mail to re-import all of my message history. So I had to use Apple Mail for a couple of days to sort of make sure that everything was working. And
Sure.
something that I appreciate about Apple Mail, I think beyond the fact that it's got a native UI and it always uses the latest iOS and iPadOS APIs, so that when iOS 15 comes out next month, it's very likely that Apple Mail will be one of the first apps to use some of the new technologies in iOS and iPadOS 15. What I really like about it is the fact that and this is also the downside of it, maybe, but it's a traditional email client, right? It supports a bunch of different email services. It lets you log in if you don't use Google, or if you don't use, Outlook, for example. It lets you log in with your standard IMAP credentials for an
Right.
email server. And it doesn't lock you into anything. It doesn't have any proprietary features. At any point, you can drag and drop a message either on the Mac or on the iPad. The iPhone does not have a drag and drop, unfortunately. You can pick up a message on iPad and drag it into something like OmniFocus or like AnyBuffer, which is a clipboard manager. And you can get a standard message URL that takes you back to that specific message in Apple Mail. And that unique link, it doesn't require any uploading to a cloud. It works locally, and it's the same URL on any device that has Apple Mail installed. So later,
Right.
that message link, you can tap it on your iPhone, and it takes you to that message. You can click it on the Mac, and it takes you to that message. So it's obviously, like, the downside of this approach of, well, it's just a standard email client. The downside of it is maybe Apple feels a little bit constrained in terms of adding proprietary features to Apple Mail, because they could do something like iCloud collaboration, or they
Right.
could do something like custom integration with some web services. But that at that point, that will lock you into the Apple Mail ecosystem, right? So it's a trade-off, and it's a decision that you gotta make. Right now, because of this open approach, what I have not discovered, but maybe appreciated again, is the fact that you have full control of your email messages and the kind of email services that you want to add to Apple Mail. With something like Hey, so in Italy we have I don't know if it's the same in the US, but we have this certified email system. It's called a PEC, and basically this is the it's an email address that you have to get and you have to pay for if you want to send like a certified email to an office or to any kind of like to a government
Sure.
agency, to your phone company, for example, and you want this email to be certified, you got to pay for it. It's like
Interesting.
10 euros a year. It's very cheap. And there's a bunch of you basically purchase these email addresses from a standard domain register, right?
Right.
And the flavor that I got, I guess, I can add to my email client via standard IMAP credentials. And with Hey, I couldn't do that, right? Because it was a locked-in ecosystem
Right.
that didn't allow me to add my IMAP account to Hey. And so with Apple Mail, now that I was using Apple Mail again, I was like, well, yeah, it's nice that I can combine Google and my certified email within the same application.
No, that's true. And I mean, it can handle, obviously, it handles iCloud, but it also handles all the Microsoft emails and Google and Yahoo and everybody's email, basically. Yeah, I hear you on that. But I guess by the same token, we've pretty much come to the conclusion that we need something more than that too, right? Just because of the volume we deal with and the fact that we work together. And as a result, that's why we're on Spark. I think the other thing in Spark that I want to mention that I like a lot is it integrates with certain apps. And actually, there aren't a lot of apps there that I've hooked up because I just don't feel like my email messages need to go to a lot of different apps. But I have hooked it up to reminders because with sending message links into reminders, And the fact that GoodTask is a client for the Reminders app, I can basically approximate the reply later feature in Hey, because you could, when you saw an email in Hey that you knew you had to reply to, but you didn't want to do it right then, you could throw it into this stack of reply later emails. And so I'm going to try doing that with Reminders and having links in my email and having tasks, pop up on in GoodTask to get that done and see if that works as well as the reply later feature did for me. So I don't know. It's a project this week that I didn't really want to have to do, but it was obviously the right thing to do for a lot of reasons that we already discussed. And it's just been a little bit of a pain, and now it's been an adjustment because you and I have ripped up an awful lot of systems this year, and I had that moment this week where I felt like everything I'm doing is completely new, foreign, and a little bit messed up. And I feel like I got to settle this all down before we get into the busiest part of our year. And it's getting there, but adding email to that stack wasn't really something I had anticipated. But I think I've got it as of yesterday. I spent a couple of hours getting everything set up exactly the way I wanted and across all my devices. And I think I'm in pretty good shape at the moment.
Right.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by our friends at Linode. You can simplify your cloud infrastructure with Linode's Linux virtual machines, helping you develop, deploy, and scale your modern application faster and easier. Whether you're working on a personal project or managing enterprise infrastructure, you deserve simple, affordable, and accessible cloud computing solutions that allow you to take your project to the next level. Linode has data centers all around the world with the same simple and consistent pricing regardless of your location. Linode's new Cloud Manager makes it super easy to set up a server near you with low latency. You can expect simple pricing with no hidden fees, unlike other cloud hosting companies that might charge you for services you don't need and don't use. And you can check it all out for free. Get started right now on a Linode plan today with $100 of free credit for listeners of App Stories by going to linode.com/appstories. In addition to shared and dedicated compute instances, you can use your $100 credit on S3 compatible object storage, managed Kubernetes, and a whole lot more. If it runs on Linux, it runs on Linode. So head to linode.com/appstories and click on the Create Free Account button to get started today. Go there now and check it out. Our thanks to Linode for their support of the show.
I think all this journey away from Hey, back to Gmail, to Apple Mail, and then Spark, I guess it put us in a position to think about the idea of app silos again. So the idea of data portability and what happens when you're using a service that locks you in and doesn't make it possible for you to export data or to switch to something else, right? And sort of what are the trade-offs that you need to think about when you're using that kind of service? Because like we just said, maybe sometimes it's worth it, right? Because John and I, we need to have some kind of sharing, but we also know that like we can use that functionality today. But if tomorrow we choose to switch from Spark, we are going to lose those comments. We're going to lose that sharing feature because that is specific to Spark, right? And so it's always a matter of making a decision yourself, like when it comes to these proprietary features and data that is locked into a specific service. But I think also at the same time, it's not at least for me, I tend to decide these things on an app by app basis.
Right.
Because for example, I may agree to do something like this when it comes to email, but when it comes to writing, for example, when it comes to managing my articles, the hundreds of articles that I've written in the past few years, I've always been in favor of fully controlling my work and just having plain text files that are markdown files that I can move around. And I just couldn't accept the idea of, I know writers that have blogs and work for bigger publications, that store all of their work in Google Docs. And I just couldn't
Right.
I cannot even begin to imagine that. So I guess for some things, data portability and having full control, like going beyond the silo, is much more important than, say, something like email.
Yeah. And look, I think this is an important topic for iPad OS because this is something I wrote about for the monthly log last week for Club Mac Stories members. I feel like there are a couple of different tentpole features that Apple really should address in iOS 14, 15 and Mac OS this year. And one of them is a better file system for iPad OS, not just a better files app, but I would go as far as requiring the file system to be exposed by developers because we're stuck in this weird in between place. I always think of this as the Evernote problem because, and Evernote is, because Evernote was historically very difficult to get data out of. Now, there are solutions, but a lot of them are pretty complicated because I think it's all based on XML. And the thing with the iPad is that, when the iPhone was launched, even before the iPad, the file system was completely hidden. And part of that, and that made a lot of sense, that was, a way to make the iPhone easy to use. And the iPhone was very much a one app at a time device. But that's not how the iPad is today. But the file system still kind of is. And developers can create apps, and there are a lot of text editors out there yet today where you don't see your underlying files. They're there in the app and they sync across all of your devices and even maybe with your Mac, but they're all hidden away with, long random text string file names away in the app bundle somewhere on your system and not easy to find. And that I don't like. And I feel like it's holding the iPad back to a degree, that it's time to kind of go back in a way almost to when we didn't have a files app and everybody was building text editors based on Dropbox, because Dropbox, at least, there were a lot of problems with text editors based on Dropbox, and a lot of them had to do with the Dropbox API. But at least you had files that you could access, whether with the app that you were using on your iPad or on your Mac or really anything. You could use multiple apps working against the same database. And I feel like that's a structure that we need to go back to. Now, it's more complicated than that, in that when I think about this, I'm like you. I think a lot about markdown files and plain text files, which are very portable and supported by a large number of different kinds of apps. That's not always true with all apps, and not all apps are perfect for this. There is a room and a place for proprietary formats, but to the extent you're talking about things like PDFs or JPEGs or text files, things like that, I think all of that should be exposed in the file system so that you could use any app you want. Because the reality today is that you're not going to use necessarily just one app with that content. You may start out in a text editor typing away, and then you may want to open it up on your Mac in something like Marked to see a preview of it. Or you may have a different app that you want to use to upload it to your content management system or whatever it is. The ability to have specialized apps that operate on the same set of data is important. And I don't like the fact that too often still you have to export, leaving some kind of old version behind in one app and starting fresh in the new app.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also an interesting approach is what something like Obsidian, for example, is doing. Where and there's other apps like this. Maybe Devon Think to an extent is kind of similar. But I think
Right.
what Obsidian really does well is at a low level, it's just a folder of markdown files and attachments, like images, for example. And so the database is always exposed by default in the file system. And in their upcoming mobile app, it's the same deal. Like you can store your quote unquote database in iCloud Drive or local storage or compatible file providers, and it's just a folder. But what I guess the secret trick is, Obsidian is doing a lot of work on top of that folder right, on top of the file system to create the UI and all the different options that you see in the app for things like backlinks and file transclusion, local attachments, all that kind of stuff. So it's this fascinating approach where data portability is enabled by default because all the assets are just stored in a file structure, in a regular structure in the file system. But then it's the app that is doing a lot of work on top of that, and it gives you custom UI tools and custom navigation tools to make sense of all those files. And I think based on the excitement that I see around Obsidian these days, I think that and also Devonthink, I also think Devonthink users are, they value Devonthink because it also works like that, especially on the Mac. You can point it at a folder and it does all of that, that custom indexing for its advanced search and its intelligence features, all that kind of stuff is exposed in the file system. And so I think there's a lot of excitement here. And I have a feeling this is going to be like one of the trends going forward, especially once Obsidian launches on iPhone and iPad. And I think also this is sort of also, it says something about iOS and iPadOS, because I do believe that Apple needs to make it easier for developers and for users to know that it's possible to have these more advanced implementations of the files framework, where it's totally possible in 2021 to configure an app, if you're a developer, to say, I want to go beyond the sandbox of iCloud Drive and I want to store my files somewhere else in the file system. Or I want to gain persistent access to folders that are located outside of my sandbox. Perhaps they belong to a different application. This is possible in 2021 for developers to implement, but very few developers know about it. And these integrations are very rare. They're not common at all. Like, I ran into an implementation of this a couple of days ago. Sylvia needed to put together a video in LumaFusion on the iPad. And she needed to import a video file from Photos, but an audio track from Files. And LumaFusion, I guess maybe people don't know this, but LumaFusion is one of the few apps that takes advantage of the folder bookmark technology of the Files framework to let you create a persistent bookmark for any folder in the Files app. So if you're a video maker and you store your assets, in the same folder, and you want to fetch files from that folder over and over, you can create a persistent bookmark in LumaFusion so that LumaFusion then can present its own UI on top of, fetching files from the Files app, but without showing you the Apple interface for the file speaker. So these features are technically possible. I can count the apps that implement these APIs on one hand, I think.
I know. Unfortunately, that's very true.
At a fundamental level, I think users, if given the option, this is my thesis, I think, to wrap up this episode. If given the option, users would prefer data portability and having full control of their files. Unfortunately, implementation of these things needs to be widespread for users to know and to care. So maybe things will change, hopefully, especially on iOS and iPadOS in the future.
I hope so. I feel like there needs to be more focus this year, and I think it needs the leadership on this should come from the top with Apple, really, of both getting data into and out of apps. And this data portability and using file structures and bookmarks are all part of that. But so is things like extensions and shortcuts and all the other things that we've talked about over the years. So I'm hoping that we see more of this coming from Apple this year and developers down the road. All right, Federico, I think that's a wrap for this week. I want to thank our three sponsors again, and that is Pingdom, Backblaze, and Linode. You can find both of us over at macstories.net. Federico is also on Twitter and Instagram, where he's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees, JOHNVOORHWES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.